Welcome to Because Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles 24/8. I'm Allison.
And I'm Erica. And before we start, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast or stream us on Spotify and on YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we have a super fun episode today. I'm really excited about it.
We're taking a break from 1966 to talk about a related topic, which is the Beatles and Capitol Records. We are joined today by author and historian Andrew Cook. His latest book, Capital Gains, Exposing the Conflict Between the Beatles and the Record Label That Made Them, dives into the relationship between the Beatles and their U.S. label, Capitol Records.
Yeah, so this book, it draws on record industry documents, interviews, and much more with Capitol employees during the 1960s. And it sheds new light on the circumstances surrounding the band's acceptance by Capitol, the unprecedented marketing campaign, which is so fascinating, that led into their first U.S. visit, and the many, many personalities and conflicts that went into creating the American Beatles albums.
This is a super interesting book about an interesting topic that we don't really hear a lot about. I think that he uncovered some facts that I've personally never heard before in Beatles history.
I learned a lot from Andrew and his book and the interview you're about to hear, and it's really cool.
We ended up chatting with Andrew for nearly 2 hours, so today we're bringing you part 1 of a 2-part conversation. Capital Gains is Andrew Cook's 15th published book. His other works cover a wide range of 19th and 20th century historical topics, including the history of British spy organizations, the Romanovs, Jack the Ripper, and the Great Train Robbery. Plus, he's contributed to more than 20 films and documentaries based off his books and research since the publication of his first book in 2002. His 2013 publication of The Great Train Robbery, The Untold Story from the Closed Investigation Files, led to a TV documentary on UK's Channel 4 and the highly acclaimed Chris Chibnall films, A Robber's Tale and A Copper's Tale, which starred Jim Broadbent and Luke Evans. In addition to his film and TV credits, he's written for The Times, The Guardian, The Independent, BBC History Magazine, and History Today. So a very, very prolific author and historian, and we're so excited. So welcome, Andrew Cook. Thanks for being on BC the Beatles. We'll get right down to it. So let's start a little bit with you. Your previous books cover a wide range of things from the Romanovs to spy networks to Jack the Ripper. What was it that pulled you into this particular story about the Beatles and Capitol Records?
Well, I suppose there are two answers to that. I mean, the first one, I've been a Beatles fan, big Beatles fan, since I was probably 7 or 8. My cousins, who are about 10 years older than me, were what you would call first wave Beatle fans, back in the early mid-1960s. So I kind of grew up listening to, hanging around with them, listening to their records and getting hooked on it from that point of view. So I suppose of all the things I've ever been interested in, this is the Beatles is probably the biggest kind of interest and fascination for me. In terms of the books, yes, you're absolutely right. If you look at my website and you look at all I think it's 15 books now, not sure, in the last 25 years, on the surface, it seems that there's no rhyme or reason between all of these books. They're all very different. But there is actually one invisible thread that runs through the lot. And that was this kind of principle I've had. Never write anything unless there's something new to say. And if there is something new to say, 9 times out of 10, it will be based either on new testimony from people who were actually there at the time. And secondly, documents, archive material, which again hasn't been available until very recently. So when I came across those two very things a few years ago, I sort of grabbed it with open arms. And that's the reason I wrote the book. Big, massive fascination to me, something I've been thinking about ever since I walked into a record shop in God knows when, 1968, 69. But equally, there's always got to be something new to say to me. And I hope this book, your listeners will be the judge, but it's all about shining light on something new or relatively new.
Well, I think there's plenty of new in here. which is kind of a rarity in this world. There's so much out there on the Beatles, and I think that you uncovered a really interesting thing, which we'll get to later in the interview, but really closes a logic gap, I think, in an important part of the Beatles' history. But first, let's set the stage a little bit.
Yeah. So going through the book and the history, obviously with the title is a tip off of what your thesis of the book is. But let's set the stage here. Before the Beatles even entered the picture, can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between EMI and Capitol in the late 50s and early 60s?
Sure. I think it was quite a strange relationship. And of course, it was almost a unique relationship, because if you think back to the 1950s and 1960s, the pattern, not just with record companies, but with industry generally, it was pretty much a story of big US industrial companies and groups buying entities in the UK and Europe and so forth. This is a very unique story of role reversal. This is, frankly, a very backward-looking, almost going out of business UK company called EMI. They were on the verge of bankruptcy when they bought Capitol. I guess a lot of your listeners will be familiar with one of my favorite TV series, which is from the States, called Mad Men. I'm sure you've seen it or heard of it. People either love it or hate it.
Love it.
Huge fan, huge fan.
I just loved it. I just couldn't get enough of it. But obviously in that Mad Men series, you've got a spooky parallel where a UK ad agency buys Sterling Cooper. And for the best part of a series, it's featuring the crazy relationship they've got with these upper class, snooty, out of touch English guys who have bought a very successful American ad agency and are kind of telling them how to do it. Well, and it's the same thing with Capitol and EMI. You could sum it up by saying that Capitol were at the top of their game. They'd come from nowhere. You look at RCA, Columbia, they were old timers. They'd been in the record industry from the word go. Capitol were like new kids on the block. In 1942, they were working above an old record store in Hollywood, 2 rooms, 6 or 7 people cramped in there, creating this new record label. Fast forward 10 years, they're one of the top 5 companies in the States. So a bit like the Beatles, they've come from nowhere to the top of the tree in a very short time. So as I say, number one, the relationship between EMI and Capitol, very bizarre to say the least. But again, there's another parallel. The Beatles themselves, they went from zeros to heroes in just over a decade.
It's interesting too, because if you look at it nowadays, when the US Capitol albums are no longer in print,
they've just come out again in England. They've just re-released them in England in 2024. They were sold like hotcakes.
Did they really? Yeah, we get a limited edition box set every so often, but they're just not in the zeitgeist,
No. It came out about 18 months ago. I mean, it was got massive coverage in the UK and sold very well. I don't know about the States.
I think it came out. I just can't remember it having that much of an impact.
Very expensive, by the way. So a lot of people might have been put off by the price, but and as indeed I had to think twice about buying it. But it was well worth it. Very high product, very good quality in terms of the vinyl, the sound. But yeah, as you say, it's without exception, it's kind of yesterday's news. Everybody's focused these days on the original British format. Which, if you look back to the 60s. If a British holidaymaker had talked about Beatles for sale or with the Beatles in another country, they'd have got a very strange look. What are you talking about? Because no one knew about the UK albums outside of the UK, whether that was Europe, whether it was Africa, whether it was Asia, certainly not the States and Canada. In this country, we thought, oh, brilliant, everybody loves these albums. Outside the UK, no one had even heard of them. And when you listen to, the live recordings of Beatles concerts today, okay, most of them are from outside the UK, but that's why they say, oh, here's, XYZ track is from Beatles 6 or whatever. If they'd have said, oh, it's from, it's from With the Beatles or something, the audience wouldn't know what they were talking about. So
yeah, sometimes John Lennon got it wrong too. He would announce, it's like, I don't know.
Oh yeah, because absolutely right. And that was a little bit of, a little bit of humor, but a lot of the time they hadn't got a clue which tracks were on which albums either when they toured the States. So you're absolutely right.
When you think about the relationship between Capitol and EMI, For a subsidiary company, Capitol had an incredible amount of creative autonomy.
They did. That was really a reflection of what I said earlier, in the sense that actually, again, not for the first time, EMI struck a very bad deal when they bought Capitol. They put an absolute stack load of money into the company, but they weren't really able to influence the company one jot. And one of the things that was actually written into the contract in 1955 was that EMI would have no power, no ability to tell Capitol what to release, how to release it, how to run the company. EMI were just really interested in I don't know what you call it in America. In the UK, we call it a dividend, when a company makes a profit and the shareholders divide up the spoils. So EMI was only really interested, in the profit that Capitol would make, but also because they wanted to release Capitol products in Europe and in other parts of the world. They tried very hard, of course, and it wasn't just the Beatles, to get Capitol to release UK records and albums in the States, but they never had much luck with that, partly because an awful lot of the stuff wasn't really worth putting out in the States, but that's another story. So yeah, EMI got the wrong end of the deal on that. Capitol did fantastically well out of that deal. They got massive money pumped into the business. They re-geared the business. They expanded. Their profits increased threefold within the first 5 years. And EMI were left in London twiddling the thumbs, wondering what they'd done.
And that leads to what I think is the central crux of your book, in that Capitol had the right of refusal on UK product, and repeatedly they rejected the Beatles over and over again. And then all of a sudden, there was this massive conversion after these rejections. Both Capitol's international A&R man, Dave Dexter, and President Alan Livingston both described these almost religious conversion experiences to the Beatles. Your book uncovers some new material about what really was going on behind the scenes. So can you talk a little bit about that scenario and what actually pushed Capitol to yes?
Yeah, I think it was more accident than design. And of course, I think we need to put it into context first. Capitol were not unique in turning down 98% of British product. Columbia spent half their lives turning down British product. RCA, all the big US record labels, they would listen to UK product every now and again. But there was a general consensus in the States that it's a bit like selling refrigerators to Eskimos or selling sand to Arabs. Let's be honest, the American record industry was the world's number one record industry, certainly in the 1950s, arguably before that too. With rock and roll, America was the number one country in the world when it came to recorded material and probably entertainment generally. And a lot of American A&R people would look at UK product and say, what's new about this? Absolutely nothing. Most UK artists were Elvis Presley imitators. I could reel off a bunch of names that you'd probably never heard of because they never made it in the States. But they looked like Elvis. They sounded like Elvis on a bad day. And who can blame all those US record industry people for saying, this ain't going to sell in the States. I'm wasting my time even listening to it. So the Beatles had an uphill task right from the start because they'd been preceded by years and years, and I'm ashamed to say this as a Brit, but mountains of junk that the UK record industry tried to palm off onto the States. And quite wisely, the record industry in America said, no thanks, take that away. So how do the Beatles break the mold? Well, that's the big question. We all know, and it's accepted history, and it's true, that Capitol had turned down the Beatles a good number of times before, as you say, they had this almost sort of Damascus-like conversion. But just as a sideline, EMI had also turned the Beatles down twice. George Martin and EMI turned the Beatles down twice before they actually signed them up. And even then, they hoped they'd go away after a few months. But again, that's another story. But what happened? Well, basically what happened was EMI tried, first of all, to get Capitol to put out Beatles product very early in 1963. Capitol said, no, thank you. So they then went, EMI, by the way, had already set up a new company in the States called Transglobal. And it was really an acceptance on EMI's part that the UK record industry had had 15 years worth of failure trying to hawk UK recording artists. So what they decided to do, they didn't give up, but they created their own company in the States called Transglobal. And Transglobal's job was to go and knock on the door of any smaller label like VJ, Swan, all those kind of folk, and say, please, 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 the big boys in the States aren't interested, but, this is really good stuff, take a listen. And to a limited extent, they were successful in doing that. So once Capitol had said no once, they went eventually to VJ, who were a pretty good label, albeit a small label. And that's really where that VJ relationship starts. As we know, that peters out because VJ are teetering on the verge of bankruptcy by mid-63. So they then end up going to Swan. Every time they go somewhere else, they always go back sheepishly to Capitol and say, oh, you've met us before, but have you changed your mind yet? And the answer is always, no, thank you. No, thank you. So your very well thought out question is, okay, so what changes then? Capitol have said no so many times you lose count of it. Well, what happened was, again, it was partly a stroke of fate, and it was partly what, I think we call in the UK and probably in the States leverage. Brian Epstein might not have been the greatest businessman in the world. In fact, he wasn't. But he was a very, very creative person, but he was good at what he knew. And what he knew was striking deals by leverage. So in other words, he'd find somebody who knew somebody else and then put a little bit of gentle pressure on them. And again, this is how he gets the deal with EMI for the third time of asking. But in terms of Capitol, he finds out almost by accident that an American publisher called Lou Levy has just recently had a very, very embarrassing experience with what he called a hungry-looking kid. And the hungry-looking kid was somebody who was introduced to him with a guitar, and he was introduced to Lou Levy, shuffled into his office, strummed about 2 or 3 songs that he'd written, and Lou Levy thought, I don't know, it might be worth a punt. So Lou Levy signs him up to a contract. He takes the hungry-looking kid down to Joe Dempsey's for a cheesecake, by the way, because he thinks he looks like he hasn't eaten for a week, and perhaps he hadn't, I don't know. And anyway, the hungry-looking kid is signed up by Columbia, and his first album comes out, and it absolutely bombs. They couldn't give it away. And Lou Levy starts to think, oh my word, what have I done now? I spent good money signing this kid up. The kid, in inverted commas, is signed up by a manager who introduces him to Warner Brothers publishers. They sign a deal there. A couple of days later, the hungry-looking kid says to Warner Brothers, oh, by the way, does it matter that I've already got another publishing contract?
Yikes.
Warner Brothers go nuts. They say, what do you mean? You've already signed up for another publisher. You can't do that, illegal. So his manager says, look, here's the money. Go back to that Lou Levy guy. Say, look, you're really disillusioned with the record industry. Your first record's bombed. You're not going to make it. You're disillusioned. You're heading home to Minnesota. Can I have my money back and you can tear up the agreement? Lou Levy thinks it's Christmas. He regrets having signed the contract, and there's the kid wanting to get out of it. So he says, yeah, that's brilliant. I'll take your money back. I'll tear up the contract. 8 weeks later, he's crying in his drink because the hungry-looking kid is Bob Dylan, and his second album sells like hotcakes. So Levy is he just doesn't know where to look. It was suggested to Lou Levy, Lou, you've made this massive mistake. You've let Bob Dylan slip through your fingers. There's this group in England that we think is going to do really well. The only problem is Capitol just don't want to know about it. And again, to cut a very long story short, Brian Epstein found out that obviously Epstein knew, EMI knew, that the big obstacle at Capitol was Dave Dexter. Dave Dexter was the international A&R guy. And like all record labels, the executives know nothing about music themselves, or very little music. They rely on the judgment of the A&R people. So they said, look, we've just found out that an very old friend of yours, you've known him nearly 30 years, a guy called Dave Dexter in Hollywood, he keeps turning us down. He's way off on that. You're an old friend of his. Can't you give him a friendly call and tell him or persuade him that, to see the light and to stop embargoing the Beatles. And that's exactly what happened. It was made well worth Lou Levy's while to do that. And, he ended up being one of the richest people in publishing. That's a different story, but that's how it all happened. It's all about leverage. It's about finding somebody who's got a little bit of a relationship or leverage with someone else that you want to influence. You can't influence them yourself because you don't know them. You haven't got any hold on them. But if you can find someone who has, that's the key to success.
And when did this happen? Was this around September, or was this just when word was getting around that the Sullivan deal was going through?
We can pin it down quite specifically. In England, and you've probably never heard of this program in the States, but there was a very famous TV show in England at the time called Jukebox Jury.
Oh,
and as the name suggested, you might have heard of it, yeah. I don't know if it was ever on in the States, but basically it featured about 7 or 8 new discs that had been literally released that week. And they would have a jury of celebrities who would vote it a hit or vote it a miss. Now, this particular edition in October of 1963, Brian Epstein was one of the panelists. And after the event, he had dinner with a friend of his who was very closely connected. In America, you call it Tin Pan Alley. In England, we call it Denmark Street. Some people call it Tin Pan Alley as well. But basically, he loved it. It was a great raconteur, this guy called Lionel Bart. He was a UK songwriter, very, very successful.
The composer of Oliver.
Yeah, he did indeed. Yeah, absolutely right. And he'd written a whole string of UK pop songs and rock songs as well. But Lionel Bart was a very close friend of Epstein's at the time. And he just loved to tell stories, gossip about other people, relate stories that he'd overheard, and all the rest of it. And one of the stories that he told Epstein was this new hot off the press story about this poor old guy, Lou Levy, and how he let Bob Dylan slip through his fingers. Basically, fast forward a week or two, Epstein has now done his homework. He's got a contact, an old school friend of his called Jeffrey Ellis, who works in New York. He asks Jeffrey Ellis to find out everything he can about Lou Levy. And not only does he find out everything there is to find out about Lou Levy, he also finds that Lou Levy's number 2 man is actually a Brit who emigrated to the States, I think in the late 40s, early 50s. And what's more, the $64,000 prize, he knows Dave Dexter. Dave Dexter was a music magazine, music paper editor in the 1940s. And he, like Levy, he was a jazz buff, and they were part of this little gang of 4 or 5 people. And they were just massive mates, massive friends. So, this is amazing. Not only have we got this guy who's got a reputation to retrieve, Lou Levy, we've also got a guy who is a great, great pal and still is of Dave Dexter, even though they live now on the opposite side of the, one's in Hollywood, the other one's in New York. But Levy's also got a number 2 guy who's a Brit. So that's why when just before Epstein goes to the States to, talk to Bernstein about Ed Sullivan and all this kind of thing, that's when the thing starts cooking with Lou Levy. So we can pin it down to about October, November 1963.
It's just this perfect storm of all these things happening and a bunch of people also realizing at the same time, we're going to make a lot of money if we do this together.
Or can do, absolutely, yeah. And as I say, Levy wasn't doing it. In England, we say doing it for love. That means you do it for nothing. Levy, was intrigued because, as I say, he had a vested interest in terms of retrieving his very dented, bruised and discredited reputation. The man who turned down Bob Dylan. What an absolute idiot.
It's rough.
But Epstein always believed in sweetening the pill. It wasn't just arm behind your back kind of thing. It was sweetening the pill. So how did he sweeten the pill? Well, he apart from Levy whispering in the ear of Dave Dexter, the message from Levy was also, by the way, Capitol, if you agree to put out this Beatles single, next single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, I will put an absolute stack of money on the table for you to promote it. You don't even have to use your own money to promote it. How much better does it get?
Amazing.
Absolutely. So Levy isn't running a charity. And of course, it's already been explained to him that whilst this is a little bit of a gamble, if it actually comes off, Levy's going to have more money than he knows what to do with. And basically they say, well, look, if you put the money on the table first, we'll give you the publishing rights to I Want to Hold Your Hand. So if this record takes off, you're probably going to make a reasonable amount of money back as the publisher of a multi-million-dollar selling single. And that's exactly what happens. Obviously, I Want to Hold Your Hand goes to the top of the charts like a rocket. Levy is the publisher of the A-side. Brian Epstein's lawyer, by the way, is the publisher of the B-side. But again, that's yet another story. So again, it's the best way of incentivizing people, but you pay them back with jam tomorrow. You know, if the record takes off, you help yourself to the income from it.
They got plenty of jam too. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we talked about a few of these characters, and I will encourage readers to go pick up this book, Capital Gains, so that you can read more about people like Dave Dexter and Alan Livingston. But let's talk a little bit about Dave Dexter.
Yeah, I'm sure.
He's got a pretty villainous reputation for chopping up the EMI records, putting reverb on everything, changing the covers, all this stuff. But your book paints a much more complicated picture about him. So who was he really, and how did he end up in what is really this unenviable position as the A&R man who rejected the Beatles multiple times?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, who was Dave Dexter? I mean, he, unlike UK music executives, he was a massive music fan himself. I mean, again, that's what slightly makes Capitol different. The original founders of Capitol were a music publisher, a record store owner, and a songwriter. And, you know, it was built on the fact that they love music. And a lot of the people they employed early days, not all of them, but a lot of them were big music fans like Dexter. Dexter started off life in music by editing and contributing and writing to some of the biggest selling jazz music magazines in the States. He worked his way up from just writing a few, you know, page 6, 2-column articles to the early 40s, where he becomes editor of 2 very, very distinguished music magazines. So it was then suggested to him, you know, we've got this great job, Dave, at this new startup label in California, Capitol. And as I say, that's at a time when it's literally 2 rooms above a record store and there's 5 people tightly squeezed into these 2 offices. Dexter's first job actually is to be responsible for PR. And he does a massive job. You know, within a year, the number of people he's got on his press list is absolutely phenomenal. And Capitol takes off very, very quickly. Of course, it's down to lots of factors, but you've got to give him credit where credit's due. His PR work and spreading the word, using his journalistic connections, his connections with stores all over the country really pays off. He eventually gets promoted. They're really pleased with what he's done for the company. And in, I think, 1947, 48, he is given an A&R job and he makes a big success of that. That's, again, jazz, a little bit of R&B, blues, whatever. So that's just an introduction to Dexter. But I think the really great point you made a minute ago was there's this kind of view that there was something different about Dexter and Capitol. You know, they were the villains. They were carving up these Beatles albums. They were creating their own sleeves. They were, you know, doing all kinds of terrible things to these great Beatles albums and so on. And depending on what point of view you want to take, yeah, you might be right. I've got more of a sort of an agnostic view about it. But I think the number one thing to bear in mind is something that almost every music fan I speak to doesn't appreciate, that it wasn't just Capitol. Every US big label was doing the same thing in terms of artists that were coming into the States. And what's more, the same thing was being done, but even more wide scale over here. So here's Rolling Stones Now, a US album. In this country, we'd never heard of it. The Rolling Stones catalogue was treble butchered by London Records in the States. In England, Elvis. Here's an album that my grandparents bought called Elvis Presley No. 2. You won't see it in America. EMI put Elvis's records out in the early days, in the early 50s, and they completely butchered his catalogue. Album sleeves that you'd never see in the States, mixing up tracks. So if we're going to stick our tongues out at that sort of practice, fair enough. But let's not pretend that it was just Capitol and it was just Dave Dexter that was doing it. And again, after the Beatles, as I say, the Rolling Stones on London go even further than Capitol in terms of reinventing albums and all the rest of it. The Yardbirds, all the UK artists who end up on Columbia and Capitol and wherever else. It happens to all of them. Jimi Hendrix, okay, he was an American, but he was discovered in the UK and he was signed up to a UK label. Hendrix catalogue in the States is very different to Hendrix catalogue in the UK. Different album sleeves, different tracks. So let's try and get out of our minds that kind of prejudiced view that it was just those terrible, awful people at Capitol Tower who got into butchering people's albums and sticking new names on them and tinkering around with the tracks. Everybody did it. So whether you loved it, whether you hated it, whether you couldn't care less, everybody did it. So let's stop pointing a finger to Capitol.
Well, I'm glad to see that the UK side is just as creative with album titles as the US was. Elvis #2 is kind of equal to the Beatles' second album.
Absolutely, yeah.
One thing I think is interesting about Dave Dexter, he was assigned as the head of international product.
Yeah.
It's not his fault that the British invasion happened to be international product all of a sudden. He was putting out a very successful international series called Capital of the World. It wasn't like he was just rejecting everything.
No, absolutely. He was doing the job that the Capitol Board paid him to do. And as I say, he was doing nothing different from any other A&R guy in Columbia, RCA, wherever else. As I say, they too, yes, every now and again they took a sniff at something that had come from England, but most of the time they wouldn't even, cock a deaf ear to it. They weren't interested. And as I say, let's be honest, British rock and pop product before the Beatles wasn't great. It was really just pale imitation of America. That's what it was. We got into rock and roll around about 55, 56 in England. And, before you could throw a stick at it, kids from all over the show were being turned into sort of plastic Elvises,
right.
And a lot of people used to say to the English artists, why do you sing in an American accent? Well, it's because you're copying what you're hearing on the radio and you're buying these records, these American records and all the rest of it. So British music on the whole, by and large, British music up until about 63-ish was just really recycling and copying what was going on in the States. And of course, you could say the whole thing happens in reverse once the Beatles hit in the States.
Sure.
Half the American groups then managed to comb their hair forward and come up with names like the Byrds and the Monkeys and stuff like that. So, you get this role reversal in sort of 2 or 3 years before, again, obviously, the scene changes again in, late 66, 67, when it goes West Coast and all that kind of stuff. So number one, Dexter and Capitol weren't doing anything that everybody else wasn't doing, which was to look very cynically and condescendingly at British product. The Beatles, as I say, only kind of got hooked up with Capitol purely by accident. You couldn't have blamed Epstein and EMI for giving up for a ghost in late 63, but Epstein was one of those people who just never knew when to quit. And I suppose it was a good thing that he didn't, because again, any other manager of the Beatles Epstein had been turned down by most, not all, but most UK record labels in the latter part of 1962. Not quite the way it's told in the books, by the way, but the long and short of it was that even he was getting massively despondent about the rejections he was getting for the Beatles. Dick Rowe told him, for example, Mr. Epstein, go back to Liverpool and concentrate on your record shop. Groups of guitars are out of fashion. Go back to your record shop. So the Beatles, and they acknowledged it, owed Epstein a massive amount. Without him, they probably wouldn't have got a record deal in the UK. So yes, things do happen sometimes, partly by coincidence, but also by hard work. I think it was Confucius, the old philosopher, who said he didn't believe in luck. He said, I don't believe in luck, but I'm just paraphrasing Confucius. I don't believe in luck, but strangely enough, the harder I work, the luckier I get. And that's exactly what happened with Epstein.
Like that.
The harder he worked, the luckier he got. And eventually, it did strike gold and the doors opened, and we wouldn't be talking about it today if he hadn't have succeeded.
I want to pivot a little bit to once the Beatles were signed, another really interesting thing happened that you discuss in your book, in that there was this massive, seemingly grassroots bubbling up of Beatlemania in the States. In October, November, there were maybe 1 or 2 articles, mentions about them, very, very little. And by January, February, there was this huge explosion.
Absolutely.
You think of it as organic, and it certainly was organic in the UK, but your book shows how carefully Capitol actually engineered that. And we're talking about Mad Men earlier.
Yeah.
They had a marketing campaign worthy of Madison Avenue.
Well, it was. And let's give ordinary Americans credit where credit's due. I think there was a very small but growing audience for the Beatles in the States, perhaps in late 63, early 64. They were already selling reasonable numbers of records in Canada. But of course, the population of Canada at that time was actually less than the population of New York. I think you could draw the analogy that there were sparks appearing. And what Capitol managed to do very skillfully was to pour an awful lot of gasoline on those sparks and create a very large fire. But again, as you say, and I kind of labor the point in the book, it wasn't just a matter of Capitol taking Lou Levy's money and just blowing it on anything. They had, again, uniquely very, very talented marketing people. They had a number of people on their marketing team who had literally come in from Madison Avenue, Mad Men, actually worked on some of the campaigns that in the fictional firm in Mad Men, like the Volkswagen and a number of those things, where the Volkswagen campaign wasn't actually a Sterling Cooper campaign, but in reality, it was a real campaign. And what it did was to do something totally new in marketing. It was to say, well, let's pull in all the reasons why people hate this product or tell us that they wouldn't touch it with a barge pole and try and turn it around. So, people say, oh, Volkswagen, it looks horrible, doesn't it? It doesn't look anything like a car. It's small, all this kind of stuff. So they almost made a joke of it, made humorous points. But I think, as Don says in Mad Men, we've been talking about this horrible car for half an hour. What do you learn from that? That's the whole point of advertising, get people talking about it. And that's exactly what, these marketing whiz kids served up to the Capitol board as ideas. Let's look at some of what they perceived as the downside. And they'd already done a little bit of marketing in the States when She Loves You was on the Dick Clark show, I think in August 63, something like that. And the audience laughed when they showed a picture of the Beatles after playing the disc. People were quite, listening to the disc, weren't sort of mad keen about it, but I mean, they were listening to it and some of them liked it. But as soon as they flashed up on the screen a picture of the Beatles, the audience dissolved into laughter because they'd never seen a group of young lads with their hair combed forward like Julius Caesar. It just looked strange. And the name, the Beatles, they just thought that was weird. I mean, okay, of course, the Beatles were inspired to call themselves the Beatles because of an American group, the Crickets. Nobody had, as far as I know, I don't know, but no one had really laughed their heads off about Buddy Holly and the Crickets, but their appearance, that's a downer. So they looked at all the downsides and then they made a virtue of it. So just to give you one example, Beatle wigs. They made the Beatles haircut almost as one of the central planks of the marketing campaign. So, it's a really textbook example of an absolutely amazing marketing campaign. Of course, they had the money to do it. Money was not in short supply. So literally every trick in the book, they used it. They put out semi-phony music magazines that didn't say that they were produced by Capitol. They looked like they were just an ordinary street music mag. They really went to town on it. And as you say, that was really the spark that set off the explosion.
And now the products are iconic. We talk about Beatle wigs. It's like, who hasn't had sort of an experience seeing a post or prepackaged Beatle wig in, an antique store somewhere, or like the Beatle rings, or, the Ringo rings.
Absolutely.
And all that kind of stuff. So
yes,
in some capacity, the Capitol marketing campaign really, really worked. And so we talked a lot about how Capitol has carved up the albums with different track lists, different album titles, different artwork, release schedules, and sometimes even mixes. But if we could just return to that for a second at a high level, what really was the thinking behind all of those changes? And I guess, what was the reaction on the Beatles side? Like, did Capitol care what the Beatles, Brian, EMI, or George Martin actually thought?
I think there's lots of different answers to that. And obviously part of it is opinion as well. The main reason they did it, as I said a few minutes ago, was because it was the standard practice. It wasn't something that Capitol had a dream about one day and decided they were going to do it. It was standard practice. Although Capitol had been converted reasonably quickly to signing up the Beatles and all the rest of it, yes, their attitude had changed that, yeah, we're signing up the Beatles and whatever. One thing that never changed was, and probably good reason for this, by the way, the American record industry believed passionately that no one in the world knew the American market better than American record companies. And as I say, people like Dexter, people higher up the tree in Capitol. We talked earlier about when EMI bought out Capitol. Interestingly, not many months after that, there was an exchange that took place. By that, I mean that a party of people from Capitol went over to meet EMI to look around their facilities, their factories, their headquarters, their recording studios. And at the same time, or rather just after that, a similar party, which ironically included George Martin, who at that time was a classic music producer, A&R man at EMI, went over to Capitol Tower. The EMI people just had to pinch themselves. It was almost like going, Wizard of Oz kind of thing. There was technology that just knocked the heads off, recording technology, the studios, the American way of doing things. They just bowled them over and they went back to London saying, oh, we must have this, we must have that. And the board at EMI said, nah, too expensive, waste of money, forget it. Likewise, or rather opposite experience, people like Dexter and a few other people went over to England, looked at EMI and just couldn't believe it. It was like going back to the Stone Age. The recording equipment they had was just a joke. EMI at that stage were absolutely refusing to follow the American innovation of 12-inch albums. They said, we know best, 10-inch albums, that these 12 inches are never going to catch on in England. Well, it just showed how wrong they were because, as it turned out, Decca very quickly adopted the 12-inch format album, completely destroyed EMI's classical product. Most of the other UK labels adopted the 12-inch album format. EMI was still holding out, even in 1957. Eventually, they had to go with a 12-inch format. But on almost every front, the British record industry was light years behind. And as I say, people at Capitol Tower knew what EMI was all about. It was about very boring, staid, conservative record labels. All the album sleeves followed the same principle, the recording, everything, So they thought, well, we're not just going to put these things out in the States. We're not just going to reproduce the UK way of doing it, because the UK way of doing it arguably isn't working in the UK. As I say, in the mid-50s, EMI were almost bankrupt. But even fast forward to the mid-60s, they were saying, we know the American market. We've taken this record label from 2 rooms above a record store to one of the top labels in this country. Don't come here telling us how to sell records. Don't come here telling us how to market records. And to a great extent, EMI respected that. And EMI were content to let Capitol do their own thing. And of course, as you pointed out earlier, the contract they had with Capitol didn't give them any rights anyway. But even if they had, I think EMI would still probably have given Capitol the ability to do it their way. Because again, looking at it in blunt terms, what are EMI wanting Capitol to do? And really, what's Brian Epstein and the Beatles wanting Capitol to do? Yes, they want everybody in the States to hear their product and love their product and come and see their gigs. But to coin the quote from John Lennon, that's one of the first quotes in a UK music magazine in early 63. Each of the Beatles was asked, what's your big ambition in life? Ringo comes out with something, to be happy. Yeah, great, But John Lennon, blunt as they come, what's your number one ambition in life, John? To be rich. And that's really speaking on behalf of almost any wannabe pop star before the Beatles and after the Beatles and probably today. So, yeah, they wanted to make it as great musicians and make great music. But if you'd said to them, you've got a choice, you can be great musicians and be poor, or you can let this big record corporation make you millions of dollars, no prizes for guessing what they would have said. So whether EMI and the Beatles were 100% in love with what Capitol were doing, and that isn't a clear-cut argument either, by the way, but even if they weren't, one thing they weren't going to say no to was millions and millions of dollars of earnings that came out of the States and principally came out of those albums. I think I say in the book that, if the Beatles hadn't made it in the States, they would have gone on for a couple of years doing great things in the UK, but they certainly wouldn't have been living in 28-room mansions in Surrey. They wouldn't have been driving around in Rolls Royces. They might, if they were lucky, accumulated a similar earning power to people like Cliff Richard and Adam Faith, who again, not many people in the States have heard of, but they were like the big stars in Britain before the Beatles. So, they all wanted to be rich, and who could blame them? And these Capitol albums were delivering chests full of gold on a monthly basis. So who's going to kick that in the teeth? Certainly not the Beatles.
And I guess because it wasn't a uniquely Capitol method of cutting up the albums and rearranging them, maybe they came to it with some expectation, like, oh, this is what's going to happen anyway.
They weren't doing anything new. They weren't doing anything different. They're the ones who are kind of, people point at Capitol now. But I think in a way, again, you said about Dave Dexter. I mean, I'm agnostic about Dave Dexter. I'm not a great fan of Dave Dexter's, but neither do I sign up to this. Dave Dexter had horns and a tail. I don't buy that either. Dexter was doing his job. He was looking at the albums. I mean, and you can tell. I mean, one of the things I found particularly fascinating, Dexter was one of these people. I'm not one of them, by the way, but there are some people I meet in life who record almost everything they think in a diary or in a journal. And from a professional sense, he kept incredible notes on everything he did, everything he was thinking about, all these album projects. And it's clear that whether you love, hate, or can't care less about Beatles 6 or something like that, it wasn't just something Dexter put together in 20 minutes in between a drink and a cigarette. It was something that he gave massive amount of thought to. One of the examples that people often draw is Rubber Soul, which of course, it's the UK titled album, and he kind of used the UK sleeve, although they totally changed the colour of it and stuff like that. But when Dexter got the tapes from the UK Rubber Soul, he was listening to it, he was thinking about it. And of course, at the same time, although he hated folk music and all the rest of it, but you had in America at the time folk rock starting. The Byrds were taking Dylan's acoustic works and putting an electric guitar, bass, and drums on it. And Dexter was tuned. He might not always be a great fan of what he was hearing on the US record scene, but he knew which way the wind was blowing. And certainly by 65, late 65, this sort of folk rock thing was coming to the fore. What he did, I think, reading what he wrote himself, was that he listened to Rubber Soul. He deliberately pulled off a number of tracks that he said, well, they're really rock tracks. There's not really sort of folky air to them. So he pulled those off, like Drive My Car, for example. And he then had a nucleus of what he thought were sort of folksy tracks, acoustic guitar, whatever. And of course, as we know, he pulled in a couple of other tracks from Help, the B-side of Help in the UK and whatever, that actually sound very, very similar. They're acoustic numbers, they all gel together. And of course, Brian Wilson, the genius behind the Beach Boys, he waxed lyrical, not just at the time, but in decades later in interviews. He said, the greatest album ever, Rubber Soul. He said, the first time I heard it, I can't remember exactly what he said, but, the first time he heard it, he was just stuck dumb. Sorry, I got my tongue twisted there. But of course, was he listening to Rubber Soul, Parlophone UK? No, he wasn't. He was listening to Dave Dexter's Rubber Soul. That record, that album, so many people in the States, whatever they might think of Beatles 6 or Beatles' second album, lots and lots of people just absolutely love to death the US version of Rubber Soul. And so do I. I love the UK version as well, by the way. But there's something special about that Dexter version of Rubber Soul, the US album.
I went to a symposium on Rubber Soul a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
And this was the main topic.
Yeah. Interestingly, we've come 2 massive steps further forward than that debate now. I'll give you 2 examples. In 1971, John Lennon is being widely interviewed after the Beatles split. And I think he's getting a bit frustrated that people keep going on about the Beatles and are you going to get back together and all this kind of stuff? Because certainly in 71, Lennon just wants to get well away from the Beatles and establish, his own career. And, somebody says something to him and he just very acidly says to them, very politely, but acidly, if people want the Beatles so much, we've moved away from that. But if people want the Beatles so much, just get a John album, a Paul album, a George album, a Ringo album, and just record them and create your own album on a tape recorder. That's number one. Number two, of course, in the 21st century, most people these days, you can put your own album together. You can make your own Beatles compilation. You can make your own Bob Dylan compilation. You can make your own Taylor Swift compilation. It's up to you. So we're all Dave Dexters now because we're all making up our own Beatles albums or our own Taylor Swift albums or our own Stones albums or whatever. So, the argument has massively moved forward. And I think it's a little bit sterile for some people to be, dare I say, stuck back in the 1960s, fighting a war that ended 4 decades ago. This silly argument about, Beatles 6, all this kind of thing. We're in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, we've got the technology to almost design our own albums and listen to what the hell we want to listen to in the way that we want to listen to it. So things have moved on, and it's now more of an interesting academic debate rather than a sort of scratch your eyes out argument.
And it's something that we really still do. We were talking to Giles Martin a couple of years ago about the remixes, and he was talking about how what he does is he tries to make those songs sound like they were written and recorded today for 21st century ears. He's doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true because, as I say, those remixes, you don't lose anything. If you really want to listen, as I do a lot of the time, to an original mono. I mean, if you listen to Revolver in mono or Sgt. Pepper in mono, massively different experience from listening to it in stereo. And again, remixing it using some technology that we've got these days that we just didn't have in the 50s and 60s is really a fantastic experience. But there are even some purists, even these days, who would knock Giles Martin or knock anyone else who tries to remix things or whatever. But what he's done is incredibly good in terms of the listening experience.
That's part one of our conversation with Andrew Cook. Next week, we'll dive into the later part of the Beatles' relationship with Capitol Records, including the changes in the post-Dave Dexter era, the Beatles at Capitol in the Alan Klein years, and of course, your favorite topic and mine, or maybe just mine, the Butcher cover.
Definitely check out Capital Gains.
Capital Gains is out worldwide today, February 24th. Pick up your copy wherever you get your books. You don't want to miss this one.
And as always, thank you for listening to BC the Beatles. And as always, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now. And give us a rating review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. And remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.